So we said today we would talk about a few questions that people have asked. We won't do this, as regularly. I mean, we've done it a couple of times now as this, but I've had a few coming in, so I'll try and get through a few of them. But before we get into that, I'd like us to read from Scripture together. So if you can find, I don't think we've got it on the screen, but Job 38. If you've got a Bible with you, if you've got a phone with you, look it up on your phone. That's the only time I'll ever say to you, look up your phone while I'm talking. Job chapter 38, and we're going to read a few verses from Job 38. So this is at the end of a period of time when Job has suffered great things. You may know the story. Job didn't exactly have an easy time of it, to say the least. He had terrible suffering, and all his friends initially were okay, and then they started piling in and telling him all the things he was doing wrong, and piling in with a whole bunch of theology which wasn't particularly helpful to him. And then the Lord turns up, which is kind of helpful, as we all know when we're in dire straits. And this is what happens. The Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? As the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb, and as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness? For I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far and no further will you come. Here your proud waves must stop. Have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth to bring an end to the night's wickedness? As the light approaches, the earth takes shape like clay pressed beneath a seal. It is robed in brilliant colors. The light disturbs the wicked and stops the arm that is raised in violence. Have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you explored their depths? Do you know where the gates of death are located? Have you seen the gates of utter gloom? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Tell me about it, if you know. And so on. And God piles question upon question upon question on to Job. And we're thinking about questions. I'll just give a few thoughts about questions this morning. And then we'll do some questions. And then after that, we're going to have just a few minutes of quiet worship as we watch a video. So think of this as a little bit of a bits and pieces kind of thing. Imagine you're flicking the TV channels and every time you're seeing Julian on every channel, which I know is a bit nightmarish scenario, but each time I'm answering a slightly different thing. Okay. Questioning, the nature of questioning. The questions that, could we have it up here as well, if that's all right? The questions that people asked Jesus often had hidden motives. And it's worth reminding ourselves that questions are there because we want answers, not just to be affirmed in our biases, right? Just remember some of those times when people asked Jesus questions, and Jesus kind of exposed why they were asking the question, because they wanted just to confirm their bigotry, for example. So just beware of that kind of thing when it comes to questions. Another aspect of questioning is that Jesus modeled question, response, and discussion as any good rabbi would. I talk about this in the newsletter, that to be Israeli meant to debate, to haggle, to argue, if you like. It means literally to wrestle with God. But that will only take us so far, as Job found. But we have to do it. So this passage in Job 38 is after Job has asked his 50 questions, or whatever they are, most of which are really, really good questions. The kind of ones that we ask, the meaning of life stuff. There's injustice in the world. There's personal suffering. These are very real and visceral questions that Job has asked. And then God turns up. And I don't think God is so much going after him for asking questions. The questions that God asked in the passage that we read aren't there, firstly, to be answered by Job, and they're a little bit to give him a bit of a hard time, but I think it's less of an interrogation and more of a, do you know what I know? I'm the Lord. Can you tell me my job? So there's a small rebuke there, but they are there to show that the Lord knows so much more. We are creatures. He is not. Suck it up. He is all-knowing and sovereign. Get used to it. You know that phrase, curiosity killed the cat? You familiar with that? It's actually a medieval phrase. It reflects a pre-modern worldview. Don't investigate things that are beyond your remit, that are above your station, is kind of what's going on there. And then, of course, the scientific worldview stepped in place and said, no, we want to investigate everything. We want to know all the answers, and we're going to develop mathematical and scientific methodologies by which we do that, which, of course, took off in the 16th, 17th century. So what I'm saying in this is there's a little bit of the curiosity killed the cat. Job, you need to know that you won't ever get answers to all your questions. Know your limits kind of way. But we all have this tendency to say, like the young child, why? Why? But why, Mummy? Why, Daddy? Did you ever say that as a kid? No, I don't remember. Job doesn't really get answers to the questions. He gets presence. And that's enough. The presence of God, he goes, okay, I can relax into that. Just like Darth Vader, right? Who said this, I know what you're getting for Christmas because I felt your presence. Sorry, I'm not even a granddad. Dad joke. And Job gets the thunderous presence of God, and it's scary a little bit, but it comes with assurance, a sense of, I've got this. Walking by faith, the reality of it does mean living with unanswered questions sometimes. We so often confuse assurance with certainty. Assurance is what we're given, not 100% certainty. And sometimes we kind of suppress our doubts that are shouting loudly. I think a mature faith is honest about questions and uncertainty, but also says, I have enough to go on walking. I'm going to start walking this way. I'm going to start living this way. Do I know my wife loves me? I have enough to go on that says she does. Will she love me tomorrow? Well, that depends on whether I keep talking about her in my sermons. But I don't have certainty, but I have enough assurance. I do have enough assurance. I will walk in the light of that. Job didn't get answers. He didn't know about the heavenly debate between God and Satan in chapter 1 of Job. He didn't know why he'd lost family and wealth. The happy ever after ending of Job doesn't totally resolve all the questions. But he had enough to go on being faithful even before God presenced himself. And so the meaning of Job for me is about having to wrestle like Job and his friends. That's part of the deal. That's being part of the new Israel, as it were, being wrestlers. Because trusting and walking as disciples is part of the deal. Not having neat outcomes always. Messiness. We have enough to go on. We walk in the available light. This is a phrase I love, the available light. We follow the breadcrumbs. If we're going, I don't know if there is a God. I'm going to follow the breadcrumbs, though. One day we will see face to face, but just now the questions will never end. So walking may be because you keep walking because I've had this subjective experience, I've had an encounter with God, I've had a supernatural experience, or it may be because you've logicked it out and you go, I've looked at the resurrection of Jesus as the kind of cornerstone around which everything else hinges, and it seems credible. I'm going to start walking. So both subjective and kind of logical conclusion, or both together, can work. There will always be more questions, is what I'm saying. But keep walking. Keep walking. Okay, so it's okay to have questions, I guess is what I'm saying and all that. It's part of the deal, but don't always expect that you'll be aware that questions will lead to more questions, I suppose I'd say. Okay, where are we? Okay, this was one question somebody gave me. I thought I'd illustrate it with some animal pictures. I can relate to God, the Father and the Son, but find it hard to relate to the Spirit. Can you help? Some people, I think, find it hard to relate to the Father, particularly in a culture where half of all marriages end in divorce, or fathers are abusive, typically fathers, if that's going to happen, or if father doesn't have, the term father doesn't include for you certain traits or has some bad traits. And we have to ask always when we think about God how we use the language of father. Now, that's not what the question was, but I think it serves to illustrate that language is difficult. It's always a metaphor. The reality is deeper. Some churches, for example, use the phrase creator, redeemer, and sustainer. But that kind of speaks more about what God does rather than about his nature. You see what I'm saying there? So, creator is something you do. Father, Son, Spirit is kind of something you are. So it depends where you want to push the language. We want a kind of image in our mind. One clue is in John's Gospel when Jesus says, he will send my Spirit, he says. I will send my Spirit. And there's a phrase there which is kind of the Spirit of me, that is of my identity, is of my personhood. And so when we talk about the Spirit, we're actually, in a sense, talking about the Spirit of Jesus. That's, if you look up in John 15, I forgot to check exactly where. And he says, look, I and the Father are one, and I'm going to send my Spirit to you. So there is a unity there between Father, Son, and Spirit. The Spirit, though it seems to be a distinct person who comes not to draw attention to himself, herself, itself, depending on how you use that analogy. In fact, most of the Old Testament analogies for the Spirit is in the feminine, so just throw that one in. But we don't like to use that because we don't want to start messing with the idea of the Trinity, where it's a Father, Son, and Mrs. God. We kind of want to, that would blow our minds and drift us into probably an early church heresy or something. So I think it's worth bearing in mind, though, that there is a growing revelation in the Bible that the Spirit is personal. Now, before we get into the weeds of Trinitarian thought, just hear this. The Spirit of God is the Spirit of Jesus who comes to us. That is the simplest way I think I can put it. This ultimately is a mysterious thing, and language is difficult once you get into the Trinity, which is why the church spent 5 or 6 centuries trying to debate exactly what they meant by the Trinity, and I'm trying to do it in 5 minutes in response to a question on a Sunday morning. So I'll move on swiftly. Another question. Now, some of these I'm going to throw out to you, but let me just respond to this one. When John the Baptist got beheaded, Jesus was physically present, but no reaction is documented or reported. Now, if by present you mean Jesus was alive, yes, he was, but he wasn't present in the situation. But he does have a reaction. He heads to the hills. You find in Matthew chapter 14, probably to mourn, probably to pray, probably to work out, okay, what does this mean for me and my ministry, and to consider the significance of this event. Is this what it means to be a prophet? And Jesus maybe is asking that question. Is it any different from me as the Messiah? And then he bursts out of that time in the hills, as it were, with the feeding of the multitude, the walking on water. And so John gets killed, and he doesn't respond by going into a cave and hiding and going, oh no, I really don't want this. He goes full on Messiah at that point in Matthew's gospel. Even at the threat of violence and death. And just by the way, historically, Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing about 40 years later, describes John the Baptist's beheading. So, when John goes into prison, Jesus says John was the greatest in a whole line of prophets. And there's a sense of a eulogy in advance that's going on here to say good things about him to his disciples while he's still alive. That's a good policy in life. I don't know if that answers the question. You can contact me if it doesn't. Okay, here's one that you can all answer for me. How can I be a good parent? Okay, perhaps a better way for us to respond together is to think of one thing that you have noticed or comes to mind as an example of good parenting, okay? Just have a think of one thing. If you're sitting beside your parent at this moment, then you can tell them the one good thing that comes to mind as an example of good parenting. Okay, turn to your neighbor and say one good thing. Okay. I wonder if anybody's heard something they weren't anticipating. And it's not a super private thing, but just... Could you share it with us? Because we'd all like to know. What good parenting traits have you heard? Listening. Great one.
Letting them know that you're always there for them.
Yep, letting them know that you're always there for them. Anything else? Modeling.
My mum loved me when I was so unlovable.
My mom loved me when I was so unlovable. I'll repeat these so that folks online can hear. Yep. Anything else?
Chelsea just said cuddles.
Cuddles. Yep. Bringing them up in the fear of the Lord, the love of the Lord. Yep.
Giving them your time.
Time.
And being honest enough to admit when you've made a mistake and apologise to them.
Yep.
And pray with them.
Parents apologizing to kids. That's always a good policy. Yep. Yep. Teaching them to fish. No, well, I failed then. In fact, there's a few of these I'm thinking, oh dear. When I read this question, what immediately came to mind was that proverb, and I always forget where it is. Did I write it down? Yes, Proverbs 22, verse 6. Anyone know what that is? Hey, that's good. Well done, class. Train a child up in the way they shall go, and they'll not depart from it when they're old. There was an Old Testament theologian, Australian Old Testament theologian 30 years ago, who pointed out that the Hebrew in that passage is really, really interesting because it uses the metaphor that's embedded in the language. You don't actually always translate metaphors from Hebrew. It uses the metaphor of the string of a bow. How tense is the string? How large is the bow? How, is it a big bow? Is it a short bow? How does that work? And so it's kind of, it's obviously some metaphor in ancient Hebrew, which is sort of like, if you have the tension too tight, the string will snap. That's a good analogy for parenting, eh? If you have it too loose, it won't be effective. And so you look at the bow and you work out according to the size and shape of the bow, what sort of tension you put in it. Does that, have I explained that clearly enough, right? So it's kind of saying, who is your child? And asking that question first before you answer the question. These are the 15 rules of how to be a good parent. But it actually begins as a child-centered approach. Does that get the approval of a principal of a school? Child-centered education. I looked at you and I thought, child-centered, yeah, that'll work. Yeah, okay. So that involves, I think, and I'm kind of feeling like I'm not always match my own expectations here, but is to be in touch with your own emotions, to be an adult in the relationship, model healthy expression, even if it wasn't modeled to you by your parents. Men especially, I think, tend to need to grow in this because our culture hasn't always modeled this and taught us that maturity. And to enable the kid as they get older to individuate, there's a good word, individuate, to gain their own sense of self and what it means to be distinct from you as a parent and to make their own mistakes, of course, but also to feel that connection as well and do that in a healthy way. You could do a whole course on this, of course, and there are courses out there which we could talk a lot more about. Good answers, though, folks. Yeah, one more.
Can I just add something? A quote that I've recently put on, I think, posters at school is prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child.
Prepare the child for the child. What do you take that to mean?
So you're developing the child, a bit like Bible verse, prepare,
Yeah.
for the way it should go, not determine where they should go,
Yeah.
and what places in your life.
So
You're preparing the child, you're nurturing
yeah.
the child as a person.
So it's their identity, their character, so that whatever life brings to them, they're able to deal with. Thank you. That's great. Yeah. We could talk a lot more about this. Okay, here's a good question. Is the infant baptism Anglicans and some other denominations, think Uniting Church, Catholic and so on, use valid if they later make a commitment to Christ as adults? Or will heaven contain only those who have been immersed? Okay, so I have to show a cartoon at this point. Even a single dry patch would invalidate the baptism. Okay. I'm going to incorporate this into the church rules in the future. Watch out. Yeah? Okay. Some Baptist Christians in good conscience want to say, A, that total immersion is biblical and therefore the quantity of water is actually vital. And B, that the maturity of the baptized is vital. So that's two distinct things, the method and the maturity. Other Baptist Christians say the amount of water is normally immersion. And secondly, being of maturity is normative. I actually really like the phrase normative, normally, and putting those in church rules, I think gives us some wiggle room. Now, different churches pitch their rules according to how they answer those questions. It says, this normal word, it says, we hold to this view, but just as there were a number of beliefs in the early church, like meat offered to idols or new moon festivals mentioned in Romans 13, we should allow for conscience. How we do that and what we do that on, that's the debate, and that's the challenge, and it's not always neatly defined. Practically speaking, some churches allow membership to all who are already clearly disciples of Jesus. And the argument would be, if a retired bishop or famous Anglican or Uniting Church leader started coming along to our church in retirement, would we refuse them membership because they held to a view on christening in all due conscience? That doesn't question whether we hold to that view, but it does say we are those who are welcoming and inclusive. Now, that in turn, of course, knocks on to questions of what does it mean to be Baptist then, and whether that would slowly be undermined by accommodating such views. But in turn, that's countered by a view that says, well, what unites us is more important. Or the argument that says, as the years go on, denominations change anyway. 80 years ago, it was don't drink, don't chew, don't go with girls who do, right? I've chewed, I've drank, etc. But the question was asked of me, who grew up in Anglican but was converted into a Baptist church and couldn't believe when I wasn't allowed to be baptized by the local minister because he said I had to go through all these classes. I didn't read that in the Bible either, but he insisted I go through all these classes. So But I had parents who in good faith saw their christenings as valid. So quantity of water for me is not a major issue. I do think the text suggests linguistically that was a large amount of water there. There are archaeological reasons for suggesting pools and so on. And pouring of head may have been done in the pools when the person was in the water, but it also suggests from the language that the baptizo in Greek is literally scuppering of a ship. How do you scupper a ship? Right down, under. So that's why we do it the method. At Templestowe, when I was at Templestowe Baptist, we changed the rules to accommodate the frail and uniting church escapees, shall we say. There were people who were really faithful members in the church, but they couldn't come into membership at the time because they held in good conscience that their christening as a child was a valid christening, was a valid baptism. And we had two people, I can think in particular, who if I'd put them underwater, they were not coming out alive, honestly. And I'm going, you're so part of the church and so involved in the life of the church, but you're far too frail for this. So let's do the pouring on thing. So we changed the rules a little bit just to flex for that kind of thing. Now, not all Baptists do that, and some of you may be branding me a heretic at this point. But I do believe in believers' baptism, not adult baptism. I do believe that the normative should be immersion, but I want to also be gracious and accommodating for people's consciences, just as Scripture seems to show that we should be. Now, I've got a bunch of other questions. We saw that already. Look, I'll leave the other questions for another time. There were some good questions on the work of the Holy Spirit, which we'll talk about another time. What I'd like us to do now, I've kind of done this flicking channels thing between the questions, and maybe just one or two things are, left you with questions or left you with, hang on, what did you say there? What heresy was that, Julian, or whatever? Just to put that to one side for a moment. And let's remember we're in the presence of God, and just remember the God who turned up to see Job. And remember the one who's always present to be with us and to be close to us, and who calms the questions. Who calms the questions. Kathy's, of course, a wonderful photographer, and I asked her to put together a few of her average photographs, and her average is my standard of that, and put some music to it. So we're going to just do that for the last 2 minutes to notice the Creator God who is around us and always wishing for us to be present to Him and for Him to be present to us. So let's worship as we watch this.
Contained in everything I do, there's a love I feel for you, proclaimed in everything I write. You're the light burning brightly on displayed in all the things I see. There's a love you show to me, portrayed in all the things you say.